Hello my friends, and welcome back. While this is not the first pin I've made, this is still a video of several firsts for me. This is my first time using a carbide cutter, and it's one that I happen to be making myself, which is also a first. It's my first time turning this wood, which is called Mora, and it's my first time with this particular lens on my camera. And if you stick around, I'll talk about all this stuff a bit more. This is a pin that's already in progress because I cut and drilled the pin blank, and I glued the brass tubes in a while back. I had prepped several blanks in a batch, and this happened to be one of them. Today I'm turning and assembling that pin. But as this is a video of firsts, the first to talk about is the Carbide Cutter. I've wanted a carbide cutter for a while, but in my opinion the handles are just ridiculously expensive. The cheapest prices for the smallest sized handles are $60 or $70, and they go up from there. Just for a handle to hold the cutter insert? No thanks. So I bought a 1/2-inch square steel bar from a local hardware store, and I worked with that to make one for a much lower cost. I have more to do before this one's finished, including making a wood handle for it, but I was eager to turn something to try out the cutter. This video is my first test run, and the cutter worked really well. I did realize when I was watching the footage that I have the tool rest just a bit too high, as the cutting edge is supposed to be level with the center line of the lathe. Lowering the cutter a bit would change the cutting angle slightly. But anyway, I plan to make a video about making these cutters, so I won't go into too much detail on this one just yet. Just make sure you subscribe to this channel if you're interested in seeing that. So, the second first is the wood. It's called Mora, with the scientific name Mora excelsa. There's a link in the description to the place that I bought it, currently priced at $1.25 per blank. I've never turned this wood before, but the wood database says that this wood is sourced from northeastern South America, primarily Guyana and Suriname. It also says Mora has a sour or unpleasant odor when working, and although I didn't really notice it while I was turning, when I walked away for a few minutes and I came back later, I did notice a slightly sour smell around the lathe, and I hadn't vacuumed up the shavings yet. Of course, you can't smell anything once the piece is finished. I was wearing an RZ mask during turning and sanding, which might have contributed to me not noticing it at first. And by the way, if you're not familiar with it, I highly recommend the wood database. When turning exotic woods, it's always helpful and interesting to read where they come from and what to expect when machining the wood. So far my experiences have jived with what I read in the database. I'll put a link in the description. And the third first is the camera lens. This might be a little inside baseball if you're watching this video strictly for the pin making, but humor me for a minute. I shoot with a Sony mirrorless camera, which I love. The lens is a Rokinon 85mm t1.5 Cine lens, which I borrowed from a friend. It's super fast, meaning you can get a very narrow depth of field. This lens is meant for video work, so the aperture ring is clickless, meaning the aperture smoothly opens and closes without positive stops. It really does produce lovely bokeh, which is the Japanese word for the out-of-focus area of the shot. Some people pronounce it bokeh, but since that's a word that means a flower arrangement in English, I avoid it. The Japanese word is actually spelled B-O-K-E, but it was Americanized to B-O-K-E-H when it first appeared in print to make the pronunciation more obvious, so that it wasn't pronounced Bokeh. But, as the aforementioned variation in the pronunciation would indicate, this was not completely successful. See the description for a footnote on this. Back on topic, I do like this lens, but if you shoot with the aperture wide open as I'm doing here, letting in as much light as possible, the depth of field is almost too narrow for this application. When moving the cutter left to right, I'm also moving in and out of focus. I'll use a smaller aperture next time, which gives you a wider depth of field. Another thing that makes this lens a bit tricky to use for woodworking videos is that the minimum focus distance is about 5 feet from the lens, so it's hard to get the camera in really close for detail shots. And shooting in a small space, it restricts my ability to move the camera around for different angles. This lens would be wonderful for portrait-style shots of people. I have a couple of other lenses that I already own that I'll be trying out in my videos soon. I normally shoot with a kit lens, it's the 18 to 55mm zoom, purely out of convenience, but I've been wanting to make my shots visually more interesting. So that's my list of firsts out of the way. For this pin, once I used the carbide cutter to rough the blanks down to cylinders, I switched over to my spindle gouges to refine the shapes. I like putting a little ridge at the bottom of the blanks, as this gives your fingers a natural place to rest when you write, and helps it keep from slipping out of your hand. I repeat the overall shape on both halves of the pin just because I like how that looks. After I get a shape that I like, I always like to feel the shape with my hand and make sure it's going to be comfortable when you write. After turning, I switch over to sanding. For wooden pins, I generally start with 150 grit sandpaper. I do some hand sanding with the grain of the wood to try to eliminate the radial scratches that can occur from the sandpaper or the tools. After that, I run through the grits from 220 to 320 to 400. I'm not saying that those are the correct grits necessarily, but it's just what I happen to have on hand, and it works. Following sanding, I like to burnish a bit using the shavings, which helps give a really smooth and shiny surface. The easiest finish that I've used so far is Hut PPP, or Perfect Pin Polish. There are 2 bars of wax that you apply successively, and you use friction with a paper towel to melt and buff that wax into the pores of the wood. You start with the brown bar, which is labeled as a satin finish, and you follow it with the white or cream-colored bar, which is labeled as a high gloss finish. Finishing with this process literally takes only a couple of minutes, and the pin is finished and ready to assemble. Again, this is not the only or necessarily the correct way to finish pins. It's just a way, and it's one that I like. Finally, I assembled the pin kit using a pin press. The kit is a Slimline pin in antique gunmetal finish, and there's a link in the description for that. I pressed in the nib, followed by the pin transmission. Then I screwed in the ink tube. I pressed the cap and the clip onto the top half of the pin. I slid on the trim ring, and I pushed the 2 halves together. And there is the finished pin. If you enjoyed this, please let me know by liking and subscribing. That really does help out. And thanks very much for watching. I hope to see you next time.